In terms of what to expect, we have 90 minutes together, and we will have basically, we will kick off first with presentations by Dallas Birchall, followed by comments from Anaïs Jalbert, from Katja Schumacher, and from Anne Simons, and I'll introduce them in a second. After the presentations, we will then have a space for a moderated discussion. For that, you're welcome to post your questions basically anytime during the event. There is a question and answer function, and you're most welcome to use that. You can also use the chat, but preferably the question and answer functionality, which also allows other participants to sort of vote on the questions and rank them up and do all kinds of fancy things. If you pose a question, then please also indicate to which of the panelists and experts you would address that question. And then we'll relay them, we'll collect them and relay them to the speakers. And just one last thing, the presentations that you're about to see, we will share them online. And I think the colleagues at ICF can share the link in a second where you will find them, but we'll also be sending that around by email. Oh, there it is. So you find the presentations online there, but we'll also send that around after the event. Now, before moving to substance, then first to introduce the speakers that we have for you here today. And I'll start off with Anaïs Jalbert, who is from Quebec and who works for the Carbon Market Division at the Quebec Ministry of Environment and the Fight Against Climate Change, and has been working there for the last 6 years. And she's been working specifically on supporting other jurisdictions to develop emissions trading systems. She also works as the market monitor, so providing oversight for how the carbon market in Quebec actually works and making sure there's no abuse and malfeasance happening. So that's Anaïs Jalbert for you. Then we're joined today also by Katja Schumacher. Katja is the deputy head of the Energy and Climate Division at the Öko-Institut in Berlin, working there mostly on strategies and instruments for energy and climate policy, evaluating such policies, and also conducting economic analysis and modeling. Tanya has been with the Öko-Institut for a number of years now. Before that, she worked at DIW, the German Institute for Economic Research, and also completed her PhD in Berkeley in California. At the PhD was from Humboldt, but before that she also did work in California in Berkeley. And one important little snippet about her professional life is that she has been part of the team, or leading the team actually now, that evaluates Germany's National Climate Protection Initiative. So that's an effort in which the Ecological Institute is also happy to support, and plus lots of others from Germany. But so this is a big project to keep track of where these auctioning millions and billions actually go and what they achieve. And we'll be hearing some more insights from that project from her in a moment. Then we have a new face that wasn't announced when we marketed this event, Anne Simons, also a colleague of Katja from the Öko-Institut. In the same division, also working on energy and climate, but not based in Berlin, but down in Freiburg, the beautiful Freiburg in the south of Germany. And works on similar issues as Katja, but more with a focus also on international climate politics, on MRV, measuring and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and tracking whether countries achieve their mitigation targets. And she conducted some research on not so much Germany only, but also on how other European countries spent their auctioning revenues. And she's going to present some insights from that in a moment. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dallas Birchall, who is joining us from Washington today, who is with Resources for the Future, where he also has worked on carbon markets extensively for a number of years. Not only that, but also on electricity sector regulation and how that overlaps with climate policies. Including on things like distributional effects of climate policy, etc. And has been advising on the design of carbon trading systems in different parts of the world, obviously close to his home in Reggie in the Northeast, but also in California and the European Union. And so we're delighted to have Dallas and also, of course, all the other speakers with us today to take us a little bit into the mysteries of revenue use and what it can do for you. Now, just by way of sort of a super short introduction, why do we want to talk about revenue use today? It is obviously one interesting property of emissions trading that, like a carbon tax, it does generate revenue, and that opens new possibilities. Obviously, you will only have revenues if you do choose to auction or sell at least part of the allowances, which is not a must. Some systems also choose to give them all away for free. But if you do auction part of the allowances, then that generates revenue and that can be put to different uses. We'll hear from the speakers in much more detail that this picture of what share of the allowances is being auctioned or sold and what is done with the money, that differs enormously between the different systems, ranging from systems that basically give it all away for free to the other extreme of systems that auction all the allowances. And then likewise, there is quite a broad mix of what jurisdictions choose to do with the revenue. However, one commonality is that basically all of them, at least to some extent, require that the auction proceeds be used to further climate mitigation goals and to achieve more for the climate. And that means that emissions trading in this way actually has two functions, two mechanisms, if you will. There is obviously the incentive effect. There's the thing that, by making pollution more expensive, you give an incentive for polluters to produce more cleanly. But at the same time, there is also the revenue effect that, with the revenue that's being raised, you can then support other policies, other initiatives, and sort of do more for reaching climate-related goals. And what that all means and how it works in practice, that is indeed for the distinguished experts to tell us more about. But before we get to the experts, just one last thing. We will have a quick round now where we ask you some questions, you as the audience. And we do that via an online system called Menti. So what you do now is, do we have it in the chat? Yes, there it is coming up in the chat. So there's a link in the chat, or you can also go to menti.com and enter the code that you see here, which is 11792863. And should be able to see there a set of questions. And first of all, we will ask you, I want to hear your view on what do you think is the most important use of auctioning revenue, ETS auctioning revenue. And you see different options, and we'd ask you to rate whether they are very important or not that important at all. And you can see for yourself, there's a number of different options. Just to explain about the very last one that you see at the very bottom, when I talked to my 9-year-old son earlier, what I was doing today, and asked what he would think, what should be done with the auctioning revenue, his clear answer was that he should certainly get a lot of Lego from that. That was his personal take on the question. Now, please take it away and rate what you think is more important or less important. Now, and I will share the screen so you see the answers coming in. So you've got about 10, 11-ish answers coming in right now. And some clear favorites emerging. I'm just waiting for sort of a few more answers to come in. Okay, so it's especially split about my son and whether he's supposed to get Lego, with some thinking that it's enormously important, others thinking it's not important at all. I'll relay that to him. And we see certainly strong support for the statement that it should reduce either emissions directly by investing directly into sort of low carbon emission options or sort of supporting emission reductions another way, but also by unlocking further abatement potential. So we'll hear much more about sort of market barriers or barriers to further emission reductions, and how revenue can help to overcome such barriers. We see less favor for kind of redistribution, the idea that the revenue should just be handed back to the taxpayer. And we see less support for sort of buying support from groups that have are vocally opposed to carbon pricing. But we see much more support for targeted support, so where the funds would flow towards vulnerable groups. And we have a mixed picture on the double dividend idea, the good old idea that you sort of reduce the cost on climate, or that you reduce the cost on resources, and increase the cost on resource use and decrease the cost on labor. Great. Now, 22, we'll leave it at that, and then ask you a second question, which is going to be, should appear now, just very simply, I mentioned the incentive effect, so the function of the carbon price to incentivize cleaner production or cleaner consumption, or the revenue effect. And the question here is, which of the two is more important, in theory or in practice? Which one should be or is more important? And you're invited to sort of post your scale from, does the incentive effect matter more, or does the revenue effect matter more? And I'll share that as well to see how the answers come in. And I should say, when you answer that question, obviously, depending on where you are and what system you think of, that can differ, that answer. So I would just say, like, take it for the emissions trading system or the carbon pricing system that you're most familiar with. That springs to your mind first, and then answer it for that question, for that particular system. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a few more coming in, but we do see an interesting split, in the sense that there is vast agreement that in theory it should really be much more about the incentive effect, and in practice a bit of a more mixed picture, but certainly a tendency to say, perhaps the revenue effect is actually the more important one, which could indeed also be a situation where, specifically if you have low carbon prices for a long time, then that might be one sort of explanation, that very low carbon prices are not going to achieve a lot in terms of an incentive effect, but can still have some effect on in terms of revenue use. So, all right, I'll leave it at that, and then thank you for participating here, and then hand the word over to Dallas Bircher, who is going to give us his take on what can and what should auction revenue be used for, and if there is a right answer to how it should be used, then share it with us, but perhaps there's only sort of good and not so good answers to what can be done with the money. So Dallas, take it away. The floor is yours.
Very good, thank you, Benjamin, and hello everyone. It's really great to be here. Okay, I'm going to share my slides now. How did this work?
It's coming up.
Okay, good. Right, thank you. So, yeah, we're talking about using revenue from emissions trading, and I want to start by, familiar and obvious points about to remind us, because it's helpful to frame the choices that we're going to encounter in a minute. We like pricing because it's economically efficient and identifies the least cost emission reductions, and the key feature about it is this, what the lawyers call the instantiation of the asset value. As soon as we put a price on the system, suddenly in economic vocabulary, in economic terms, it has an asset value. So we've created a marketable value or financial value in some sense. And the key question, that's been of interest in economics literature for 35 years on the efficiency side and on the distributional side, is how is this asset value to be distributed into the economy? That's the way I really like to think, encourage you to think about, that you are creating a new market with new value that's going to accrue to some party, and how is that going to be distributed? Well, what does this look like in the scheme of things? Where does it come from? So this little cartoon this describes a marginal cost schedule where as we move from left to right along the horizontal axis, there is a reduction in emissions. So we go from 100% of a baseline level emissions, if you will, and then we move emissions as we move from left to right. And that upward sloping line describes the marginal cost of incremental emission reductions. And as the economist Joe Aldi likes to say, economists are concerned with triangles, everyone else is concerned with rectangles. And that's illustrated in this picture, that from an economic measure of the resource cost associated with achieving emission reductions, it's that area of that triangle, because as you move from left to right, that represents the incremental cost of an emission reduction, and you sum all those to get the area of the triangle. But at the price that's achieved, that price applies to all the remaining emissions in the system. And that creates this rectangle. And as this picture shows, at 20% abatement, the value of the permits or the tax revenues is 8 times the resource costs that have gone into achieving emission reductions. And actually, this continues to grow for a while before it turns around as you move from left to right in the system. So it becomes very important from a political economy perspective how this value is used or distributed into the economy. And this picture describes the evolution of thought on this. On the arrow going to the left, free allocation to incumbent firms, I think grandfathering 30 or 40 years ago, grandfathering was written into the textbooks as the presumptive way that you would move towards putting a price on an environmental asset. And under a number of influences, including importantly the polluter pays principle, there's been sort of a shift away from that to the notion that it's a payment for environmental services, that you are paying for using the resource. And then the question is, to whom does that payment accrue? Is the environmental service managed, in some sense, owned by the state, by the government? Is it a resource that licenses are given by the government to use it? Or is it a common property resource that belongs to individuals? And it's really individuals that deserve some sort of compensation for their ownership share. So the first approach, as it is manifest today, is not with free allocation to incumbent firms, is not about grandfathering, which means giving allowances away for free based on some historic level of activity to incumbent firms. Today, increasingly, it's about using allocation to firms as a strategic tool to promote and protect competitiveness for the regulated industry. So that is like output-based allocation, is that the allocation of emission allowances is distributed on the basis of economic activity or productive output. And the more that you produce, the larger the quantity of allowances that you get. So it helps to suppress the change in prices for the regulated industry. It becomes very important where competitiveness is an issue. Where the several motivations accrue under the idea of payment for environmental services going to government. And this includes further mitigation, as we just visited in the poll that Benjamin had to start with, also addressing equity or distributional goals, research, adaptation, and indeed the tax swaps, which performed rather poorly in the poll. The idea that you used tax revenues to reduce some other pre-existing taxes. But for a couple of decades, this was the leading idea of public finance economists, and less so in the literature today. And then the third is payments to individuals, which would be compensation for the loss of the harm to the resource that is owned as a common property resource. So I think to me, it's very useful to think about the picture this way. So two worldviews of who owns and the emission allowances and how these allowances should be used. What is the framework for decision making? Well, this wonderful slide is just being produced now by ICAP. It'll be in the forthcoming ICAP report. And there's a lot on here, but the bottom line is that carbon pricing auction revenues have totaled $103 billion since 2009 and is importantly growing on a year-over-year basis. And so because you can't see it, I want to show that cumulatively this reports that Quebec has 3.5 billion, the EU over 80 billion. These are dollars. Reggie has $3.8 billion for a very modest program among the Northeast states. California has nearly $15 billion now. Switzerland, 45 million. Korea, over 500 million. China, and with just the pilot programs and auctioning in those pilot programs, has raised $200 million. We could expect that to go up precipitously. And Nova Scotia, even $21 million. And Massachusetts, which has its own very idiosyncratic little auction as part of its state-specific regulation, $27 million. So this is a lot of revenue. And I want to use now California as an illustration because in California, almost all of the types of revenue uses that I have articulated have fallen into practice one way or another. So first, one sees competitiveness constituting roughly 16% of the allowance value in the state. I'm talking now not of auction revenue, but that's why I wanted to start at the beginning, so to speak, is that there's a substantiation or creation of of allowance value, and some portion of it goes to an auction, and some portion of it goes to other purposes. And the main idea I want to leave with you today is that there are opportunity costs or trade-offs here. So any decision to give allowances away for free means that there is not allowance value available for some of the other purposes that one might have in mind. And one has to address these trade-offs head on. California, competitiveness is a concern because the economy-wide program leaves industries in the state exposed to unfair competition from firms in other neighboring jurisdictions. So about 16% of the allowance value goes to protect the competitiveness for the regulated industry. Mitigation, equity, research, and adaptation, there are no tax swaps in California, constitute about 45% of the allowance value over the years. And this is not a precise number on an annual basis because that has evolved slightly over the different years, but this is roughly the case. And then compensation, which it takes the form of both dividends and explicit rate relief for natural gas and electricity customers, takes altogether about 30%, and then there's an small unspecified sliver. I want to start now by zeroing in on this competitiveness issue and how allowance value is used to protect competitiveness and why that occurs, why it suffices to protect competitiveness. So this sorry for, at least here where I am, it's 8 in the morning, so it's a little bit too much graph for 8 o'clock in the morning, but hopefully you're in the afternoon where you are, so that you can manage this. On the left side, I've showed a picture of carbon pricing. On the right side, carbon pricing with a performance benchmark, as one observes in the EU ETS or in the California Cap and Trade Program, and in Quebec, I believe, and Inés can fill us the details on this. So under the carbon pricing, the sort of standard approach to carbon pricing, you see that upward sloping marginal cost of abatement curve that I illustrated previously, and that resource triangle is the compliance costs that are shaded in there on the left. And on the right is the remaining embodied carbon costs that gets if those costs if the firm must acquire allowances through an auction, then these costs get rolled into the cost of doing business for the firm. On the right, there's a benchmark that in this case, just to illustrate, the benchmark is set at an emissions rate per unit, or tons per unit, that is, that basically cuts in half the obligation of the firm to acquire additional allowances. For every unit it produces, it receives about half of the allowances that it needs to comply. And so this reduces the rectangle that represents the addition to operating costs of the firm by half. And where you place that benchmark, going from left to right, can go so far as to almost remove all of the burden of the rectangle getting passed on through product prices, and this helps keep the firm competitive on the international stage. In fact, you can imagine a benchmark that's to the left of that dot, which actually turns into a subsidy. For a very clean firm, it might turn into a subsidy. So there's a lot of nuance into how these benchmarks get determined. That's a conversation for another day. But this is meant to illustrate that these benchmarks are really alleviating the firm of the cost of doing business. This assistance factor in California is just to show that there is actually a logic or a rationale to how the allocation gets determined. In California, I don't know if you want to remember this, but you'll have the slides. It's a product of 4 factors. An assistance factor, which reflects what is the risk of a firm to internationally. Recently, California pegged this at 100%, even though originally that was not the intent. It was supposed to be assessed on an ongoing basis, but the legislature got involved and politics gets involved. Then the benchmark is what is the, often it's best in practice or 90th percentile performance across the industry. Then there's the cap adjustment factor, which decreases by 4% per year in California going forward. It's like the linear reduction factor in the EU. And finally, output, the level of economic activity. So as that level of economic activity goes up, the allocation goes up, and that creates a production incentive for the firm to stay onshore and continue doing operations. Now, I want to, there was a reason why I showed you that picture just a minute ago and mentioned that it becomes political, because I want to describe the free allocation to industry in California. This free allocation in general is about half of the total allowance value, which you will remember from a previous slide, where I showed you what portion is available for mitigation expenditures and what portion goes to other purposes. So about half of the total allowance value in California is the free allocation, and the yellow and blue parts of this represent free allocation to natural gas and electric utility customers as a form of compensation. One thing about this before I move on is that even though this value is returned to ratepayers, it is still manifest through an auction, and it's through a consignment auction. So the utilities are given the allowances for free, but it's a conditional allocation. They cannot use them for compliance. They have to consign or sell the allowances in an auction, and then the revenue from the auction comes back to the utilities. And this serves several purposes, including transparency, price formation in the market generally, and it allows the introduction of cost management, price floors and price ceilings and stuff, which are elements of the California program, to be applied to these allowances that are being given away for free to the utilities. But here on this slide, I'm really going to focus on the green part of this, which is industry's share of free allocation. So it's about 1/3 of 1/2. So that's where we get that industry gets about 16 or 18% of the allocation of the asset value in total. And this is a little bit of a distraction, but I really want to point out the opportunity cost of this decision and to have you gird yourself against the special pleading that's going to come from every industry. Because if I worked for an industry, you would hear very strongly my concern and my case, and everybody's going to bring forward their concern and their case. But I have every incentive to exaggerate my situation, and not an incentive to say that I do not deserve a free allocation. So back in just to talk about California and the free allocation of refineries, which is the little bit that's circled down there in the bottom, just as an example that kind of stands out. In 2010, an important report identified potential leakage in allowance prices from the refineries. And there was no benefit to that, to have refinery activity leave California, because California refineries are relatively clean on a global basis. So why have refinery activity leave the state and then just have refined product come into the state and drop cars use refined product from out of state? So the economists at the time said, well, an allowance price of $25 to $50 per ton, today $30 to $60 per ton, would approach the investment hurdle that would cause refining to leave the state. So they were given free allocations. Today, so far, the allowance price has risen only to $17 per ton. So on an annual basis over the last decade, the refineries have been given about $500 million each year in value for what does not appear from an ex post position to come in a price is anywhere close to have triggered this competitiveness concern. So one has to be very astute, because I'm really trying to emphasize it's all very well and good. The refineries love getting this value, and that transfer aspect of that may have political payoff, but from an analytical perspective, a choice had to be made, and that value is not available for many of the other types of goals that also are commensurate in California. Sorry for the detailed distraction, but I hope it makes a point. Then there's using allowance value to advance policy, and I identified several of these already. Mitigation, in particular, spending allowance value to reduce emissions already covered by the cap, helps drive down the price of allowances, makes the program perhaps politically more acceptable. Some mitigation is also spent on sources that are not covered by the cap, such as natural and working lands. And equity goals are really important as part of the California process. Under statute, 35% of the value of auction revenue has to go to the benefit of overburdened and disadvantaged communities, and 25% has to be investments in those communities. In fact, 55% of the total auction revenue has benefited low-income communities. But I then have this parenthetical remark to remind you, that's 55% of the auction revenue, but that's about 30% of total allowance value, because much of that allowance value was directed for free allocation to industry and other purposes. And then finally, compensation, dividends and ratepayer assistance for electricity and natural gas sectors. And I already mentioned that the way that the allowances are given away for free and then consigned to an auction, and so the revenue comes back to the utilities. What's very interesting in California is that on a per customer account basis, every 6 months, there's a lump sum payment that comes back to ratepayers, depending on the climate zone they live in, et cetera, which are dividends, which can and frequently do exceed the cost of their electricity or natural gas bill in that given month. This happens every 6 months rather than every month, because if it happened every month, it would appear to the ratepayer as though they were just reducing electricity. The energy just got cheap. We should use more of it. So the point here is to have energy prices increase for 5 months and then deliver this compensation on the 6th month, so that the whole thing is very salient. And I'll tell you, from people that I know, especially I'm falling into this class myself, so I got to be careful, but especially older people, a grandmother that I know, this is very popular. With a young graduate student I know, this is very popular. There's a lot of money illusion. People love getting back a check, and to the extent that you are an advocate of dividends, it's worth noting that maybe a lot of the virtue of signaling with dividends can be achieved with just a small fraction of the total allowance value pie. That seems to be a case in California. And Benjamin, to mention that I once had a dinner table poll, and my when my children were kids then, I'll tell you, by far the leading choice they had was dividends. They liked the idea of getting the money back on a per household basis. But there's obviously a lot of decisions that go in, a lot of elements that go into this decision. Okay, and then a quick glimpse at RGGI. There's something quite similar there, that over 2/3 of the allowance value has gone to promoting clean energy and energy efficiency in RGGI. So this falls now, I want to telescope back out as I wrap up to say that the use of allowance value to promote mitigation is part of a portfolio of factors that affect allowance prices. There's many companion purposes, companion policies for this purpose. Things like air quality programs and energy efficiency programs and vehicle standards and low carbon fuel standards, etc. And these companion policies serve many purposes. They're burden sharing, reducing leakage, building constituencies and institutions, that getting market readiness, as we say. It may help reduce stranded assets, address path dependence in terms of technology, trying to bring directed technological change forward, address market failures and equity goals. But allowance revenue is often linked to these policies, and all these policies plus the directed use of allowance value serves the purpose of pushing down allowance prices. And so I'm going to end here by leaving this puzzle and this policy challenge that I hope we can take up in discussion, that the downward effect on allowance prices makes allowance revenue somewhat variable or less stable. And in fact, in California now, there's a requirement that $100 million of the auction revenue has to be kept in a reserve fund. That's essentially $100 million in any given year that's being taken off the table just so that they have a reserve fund, because of the variability of prices and the variability of revenues, I should say, that results from this downward pressure on prices from all these other companion policies. So I would like to leave that thought with you, that that a challenge in deciding how to use auction revenue is to design programs such that that auction revenue is as stable as possible, because that becomes very important in the political context. Okay, and with that, Benjamin, I would like to close. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dallas, very much for, and also thanks for being perfectly on time here. And we do have sort of few questions coming in. I suppose or one first question. I encourage others to also shoot their questions. We'll collect them and then have a round when the presentations are through. And I'm also sure we want to come back to that question that Dallas touched upon in terms of managing the volatility of the revenue flow, and does that create a problem and how can it be fixed? So we'll park that for later. But now, indeed, first move on to the next perspectives. Now, Dallas, one thing I liked about your presentation was the very generous use of pie charts, reminding us that this is about slicing up a pie and dividing it, and you do have to make a choice what you want to do with the revenues. And now we'll head over across the Atlantic and hear it from Europe, from Anna, how the European pie is divided up between the member states and what the member states choose to use it for, before then Katja takes over to give a few examples from the German story specifically. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Yes, many thanks, and also many thanks for giving us the opportunity to participate in this workshop and share some insights from a European perspective. So I'm now going to share my presentation, and I hope you can see it now. Does that work? Yes, okay. Yes, so after Dallas' introduction, we'll now zoom into the European emissions trading system, and then later on even more on a national level into Germany. And I will start with a short introduction to auction revenues in the EU emissions trading system and share some insights on the use of those revenues at EU level, as well as do some comparison among member states, and then hand over to Katja to talk about Germany. So to remind us all about the context of the EU ETS, it was set up in 2005 as the world's first international emissions trading system. It covers the power sector, energy intensive industry sectors, and commercial aviation. And it now just started its fourth phase. And what the figures we are going to look at in a moment relate to the third trading period, which ran from 2013 to 2020. So it just finished. Auctioning was introduced in 2010 and has now, in the third phase, become the default method for allocating allowances. So previously, the allowances were largely allocated for free to prevent leakage, and also for the reasons as Dallas has already outlined, but now more than 50% of all the allowances are auctioned. The share of the auctioned allowances has been increasing between 2013 to 2020, but also maybe worth noting is that the share of allowances that are auctioned and the share of allowances that are allocated for free varies largely between the different sectors. So while power generators must buy all of their allowances, by now, with some exceptions for Central and Eastern European member states, in the aviation sector, only 15% of the allowances are auctioned. Yes, so with auctioning having become the default method for allocating those allowances, now the revenues are quite substantial. So the auctioning has become a quite substantial financing source. And in 2019, the revenues amounted up to about 14 billion. And over almost the whole third trading period, we haven't analyzed the figures for 2020 in detail yet. The total revenues from the stationary sector amount to almost 50 billion euros. The largest shares go to Germany, Italy, and Poland, and you really can see here that Germany is, the largest share of the revenues goes to Germany, which is not so surprising considering the different sizes of the European member states and the different structures of the economy. But it's really worth highlighting, I think, that that for Germany the amount is quite substantial. So here you can see the auction revenues in the third trading period by member state. And you see again that the amounts of revenues vary largely between the member states. Generally, the revenues in 2018 and 19 were higher than in the previous years, even though there was not a linear increase of the revenues over the the trading period. And that's because the overall revenues depend on the amount of allowances that are auctioned, but also on the price. And the price has increased has increased significantly between 2017 and 2019. So from 5.8 euros per ton to almost 25 euros per ton. Yeah, but those two factors determine the overall amount of revenues that go to the member states. This slide shows the revenues from the stationary sector, and allowances for the aviation sector are auctioned separately, but we chose to focus on the stationary sector here because that's by far the largest share of the allowances and the revenues. Now, how is this revenue being used? The directive on the EU directive on the ETS, which provides the regulatory framework for the European emissions trading system, asks member states to use at least 50% of the revenues generated from the auctioning of allowances to support climate and energy activities. And in practice, about 80% of the revenue has been used for climate and energy related purposes. So more than those 50% required. And of those 80%, the largest share has been used for domestic and EU climate and energy purposes, and only a smaller share for international climate and energy purposes. So money that is channeled through bilateral or multilateral channels through countries outside of the EU. Yes, and you will probably realize here that the share for domestic and international don't add up to 100, which is a problem relating to the data we have available at the EU level, and I'll come to that again in a minute. Now, here I wanted to quickly show the variety between member states. So you can see here again for several member states, all or almost all of the revenue is being used for domestic climate and energy activities, but there are also some that report that they don't use the money for climate and energy purposes, and the gray parts of the bars show you where the use is not reported. So where we don't have the information, at least when we look at the reports available at EU level. And those figures relate to 2013 to 15. So we did not do this analysis for the complete trading period, but this is from a study from Rumble. And yes, this is again taken from the study that Dallas has already referred to. For what kind of activities has the revenue been used domestically? The largest share went to renewable energy activities and energy efficiency. Then about 10% has been used for sustainable transport projects, 8% to research and development, and then a small share for other uses. Now, there are some challenges related to the available information on that use of revenues as reported by member states to the EU at least. So within a project for the European Environmental Agency, together with CITEPA from France, we have analyzed the annual reports by member states to the EU, and we came to the conclusion that the information provided by member states is not fully transparent and the comparability of the data is limited. So there are several inconsistencies. Like what we saw before, the figures reported for domestic and international use do not add up to total figures reported. Member states report figures for committed and dispersed finance, which should not be added up. And then there's also limited detail available on the specific use of those revenues. And one big challenge here is that several member states do not earmark the revenues from auctioning allowances. So the money goes into the general state budget, but information on the specific use is not available. And I think the advantage here is that it gives member states more flexibility for using the revenues if they don't earmark those funds. And as Dallas already has pointed out, this is partly due to the unpredictability of the revenues. So as the price changes over the years, it's revenues, the amount of revenues is fluctuating, and it's of course a national decision. So the budgetary right is the key right of parliaments who can decide about how to use the funds, but without a clear link between the revenues from an ETS and the use, the benefits from such carbon revenues is not or might not be that clear to the general public. So it could increase the acceptance for climate measures if it was clear how the money was used. And also, of course, if funds are not earmarked, it reduces the transparency about the use. And when we look at the total figures for climate finance of a country reported through different channels, then it's questionable whether the spending from the spending of those revenues is additional to the climate finance reported elsewhere. And if there's clear earmarking, this creates more transparency here, because then we know better how much of the general climate finance reported comes from those emissions trading system. So yes, we came to the conclusion it's recommendable to improve the reporting system and also to provide some better reporting guidance to member states. And so because the data available at EU level is not fully complete or transparent, I think that we need to look at the country level to get a better idea of how the revenues are then used in practice. And Katja is now going to do that for the case of Germany. And with that, I hand over to you, Katja.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, we're going to zoom in a little bit now, first into Germany and then into one program that's financed by the auctioning revenues in Germany. But first, here you can actually see the volatile development of auctioning revenues in Germany over time, starting at a low level, increasing, and then of course it's a multiplication of price and number of allowances. And so with increasing prices and lower allowances, we're still at the level where we have increasing revenues. And so in 2019, for example, we had about like 3.2 billion euros available in Germany from revenues. And if you go to the next slide, then we can talk a little more about what the revenues are being used for in Germany. And despite or next to financing the German national authority that deals with the EU emissions trading in the first place, and also using it for international purposes, as Anna had pointed out earlier, we have a large share of the funding that is actually earmarked in Germany, not the funding, the revenues which are earmarked for funding of energy and climate measures within Germany by means of a so-called Energy and Climate Fund, which was set up in 2011 with the purpose of supporting the energy transition and climate change mitigation, and in particular because it needed some fund for the revenues to go into to then serve purposes of energy efficiency and climate change mitigation. The fund is actually about 4.6 billion euros in 2019. So you see it's higher than the revenues from auctioning. Additional support is granted from the federal budget. And they started this early on because knowing that the revenues are not a fixed number and they didn't want to come for the programs to come in and out, they said that they support it from the federal budget itself. So if auctioning revenues decrease, then the funding for the Energy and Climate Fund programs is still secured. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a pie chart, surprise, as to how the revenues or how the funding of the energy and climate funds in Germany is used. And then you see a big share, actually 41% is used for buildings renovation and refurbishment. So that's really important because a lot of energy efficiency potential there remains untackled in Germany. And then there are other programs going into energy efficiency for industry or generally, and also programs for electric vehicles. And then there's a little more compensation scheme for indirect emissions costs, that's electricity costs that are increased due to the EU ETS and passed on to other consumers. and there's a compensation scheme for this. But as I highlight here in this chart, we're going to deep dive into the National Climate Initiative in a few seconds. It's only 7% of the funding from the total of 3.8 billion euros, so it's about 260 million. But it's a program that's a little bit different from other programs, and we thought that it might be interesting to talk a little more about the National Climate Initiative. So if you go to the next slide, there's some information on the National Climate Initiative, which was initiated in 2008, so pretty early on, and even before the Energy and Climate Fund was set up, and with the goal to contribute to mitigation targets. But it's kind of different from other programs because it sort of starts where everything else stops. So it's trying to involve actors and consumers and business into climate change mitigation. It's focusing on a local action, so it's implemented locally, and it aims to set examples for imitation and reducing barriers to climate change mitigation. And in itself, and this is why you see the dice here, it's very heterogeneous. So it's really trying to tackle the target groups to see what their needs are and overcome barriers. In this sense, it's also very flexible because it gets adjusted continuously, which is also because it's been evaluated from the start, from the outset on. So the evaluation itself leads into a recommendation, and the recommendations are implemented immediately or pretty soon after they've been given, so that it can be adjusted to really serve the purpose. On the next slide, you see what it involves or includes. There is energy and climate concept. So it's basically setting up a concept and identifying potentials, and then how to actually tackle those potentials for mitigation. And there's a large number of individual information and advice programs and projects in there. Also, it aims at best practice exchange and networks. And then there are a few investment subsidy programs. These are the ones that are more easily, can be more easily evaluated because the investment into technologies is easier to actually calculate the associated CO2 emissions mitigation compared to like information-based projects. And there's a micro CHP program, and there cooling and air conditioning gets supported. There was a program on hybrid diesel electric buses. It deals with street and indoor lighting in municipalities, but also in setting up bicycle infrastructure. And there to the bottom right, you see 2 senior citizens on their bikes, and it even got programs like tackling mobility and transportation for senior citizens. So it's very down to earth here. Broadly, the measures can be split into the information-based measures and investment incentives or investment-based measures. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how the funding is split up. The total funding up to 2017 was about 800 million euros. And for the last few years, it got actually higher funding, and also through the recovery program in Germany, it's going to get additional funding. So up to 2019, it amounts to 1 billion euros altogether. And 60% of those are for investment-based programs, but still 40% for information-based interventions that provide either specific advice or educational programs or mass campaigns, different sorts. If you go to the next slide, you can see how the funding is split between different target groups. Target groups involve municipalities. There's a lot of potential for energy efficiency in municipalities in terms of indoor and street lighting, but also in terms of buildings efficiency, or if you look at their transportation systems. 34% of the funding go to business and business energy efficiency. And this is not the large industrial companies, because those are covered under the EU ETS. It tackles here those business and companies that are not covered under the EU ETS, so it complements it. And consumers receive about 80% of the funding. If you then go and look at the investment that oh no, go back please, that gets induced by the funding, then you see that municipalities do not have to take additional, very much additional funding into their hands because they're really scarce in money supply anyway. So additional investment is 33% in municipalities, but business are required to add in their own funding to conduct the program. So it relates to the funding quote, the rate of funding that they get. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation that we calculated is that the investment-based programs has so far, or up to 2017, had initiated about 9 million tons of CO2 mitigation over the lifetime of the projects or technologies that get supported, while the information-based programs are at about 7.7 million tons. They're a lot more challenging to evaluate, so the number is a little more shaky in terms of methodological approach. That's why we don't add them together. And municipalities are responsible for a large share of those mitigation. And down there, I put the numbers that we recently only put together up to 2019. So we are at about 1 billion euros of funding and an induced investment of about 3.5 billion euros and about 28 million tons of CO2 mitigated over the lifetime of those projects. So over the period that gets funded, but further on until the mitigation expires because the technology needs to get exchanged again or behavioral changes fall back into previous patterns. And you can also see that about 32,000 projects got funded by the National Climate Initiative. So they are the small projects, but pretty effective. And if you go one slide further, then I have a few lessons learned from the National Climate Initiative. So programs that are tackling or trying to reach people on the level, on the action level, work best if they are peer-to-peer approaches, actually. So it's either business to business, but also consumer to consumer, or even one program is from low-income household to low-income household. So they train unemployed people to go into low-income households and talk about energy efficiency, and that's proven very, very successful. Also schools to schools, that's the S2S, and then municipality to municipality. So these approaches really work very well. Also, they provide a way for mutual learning. It's also important to use existing communication channels, we realized, or networks, and not try to reinvent the wheel and set up new things all the time. Municipalities have high potentials, at least in Germany, but I think this might be the case in many other countries too. And they set examples because people can actually see what's being done on the city hall or in their street or on the common place. Also, those programs, we realize they need to differ depending on which target groups are tackled. And then also it's important to give a one-off shot and then maybe also provide additional incentives over time to make sure that daily routines, if they're trying to be tackled, get changed and continue to be changed. And of course, information-based measures are very difficult to evaluate, and quantitative indicators do never really show the real value of those programs. So we have a set of qualitative indicators too, in our evaluation program. So all in all, we realized the National Climate Initiative is different from other programs. It's very quick learning, flexible. It provides ways of trying out innovative and new ideas, and it's proven to be quite effective. Now, stopping with the National Climate Initiative, we have a few messages or take-home messages for the overall presentation. One is that the use of revenue really differs. As Anna said earlier, the earmarking approach helps in terms of transparency, but also in terms of ensuring that funding or that revenues can continuously be used for energy and climate purposes. But we are not sure actually, and this is one question also maybe interesting for discussion, but the national legislation always allows revenues to be earmarked and put into funds for environmental or mitigation purposes, or whether there are laws that require them to be put into the national budget. And then of course it's not, can't be ensured that it gets reallocated to green purposes. And with these words, I would like to thank for your attention, and I'm happy and open for questions. And after we hear the next presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Katja. I just have a little technical problem on my side, so I just had to come in through the mobile phone and just restart the computer, so you can also see my face again in a second. So, but I hope you can at least hear my voice right now. So thanks a lot, Katja, for giving us, and Katja and Anne for sharing with us the European side of the story. And then to round up the impressions, then let's hear it from Anaïs, and let's learn about what Quebec has been doing or is doing, will be doing with the auctioning revenues that it receives. So how is the money being spent? What effects are you achieving with the spending of auctioning revenue? And also what perhaps can others learn from Quebec's experience?
Yeah, thank you for having me. You'll see I have my fair share of pie charts as well. Just gonna launch the presentation mode. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Good. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm usually more in the market oversight side of things. But I've been accompanying, as Benjamin mentioned, a lot of different jurisdictions in their design of ETS programs. So happy to share my vision on that. And if you have some more specific question on some programs, I'll just put you in touch with my colleagues who are very much involved in that. So I'm here to speak about the Quebec approach to carbon through ETS revenues. Our target, just as a quick recap with our first pie chart here, is that our reduction target for 2030 is 37.5% below 1990 levels. And our emission profile, as you can see, the transport sector is our biggest problem, our biggest target now. And you see how this is also translated in the main focus of the programs I'm going to talk about later. We also are going to be supporting industry, of course, and I'll talk a little bit about the buildings, residential and commercial as well. And as you can see, our electricity production, which is the aspect that is very different from other perspective, is that our electricity production is mostly from hydroelectricity, so there's not a lot of GHG emission there. As a quick recap from the cap and trade system program, and I know Dallas knows it a lot, but for the people who might not know that much in the audience, our program started in 2013. We became linked with California's on January 1st, 2014. And emission units are fully fungible within the joint market. So there's no origin issue between California or Quebec. It's all the same to us. In Quebec, we believe that about 80% of our GHG emission are covered by the cap and trade system. And for the first and second compliance period, we were 100% compliant, so very happy about that. And we are waiting for the third compliance period to end. It should the next surrender event is on November 2021 this year. We have annual decreasing caps that are designed to meet our GHG targets. And every year, the pool of allowances shrinks in order to put more pressure on the economy and the covered emitter themselves to reduce their emission. As you can see, that's Caps in yellow are California caps, and Quebec's caps are the blue ones. We're a very small market. We in Quebec were about 88 million people. So it just shows how different our situations are, but we can still work together. So just for the caps for Quebec, I'm just gonna do a quick recap or how we distribute the emission units that we call. Those are called allowances in California. So I'm gonna take the 2020 bar and just split it so you understand how we distribute every year the annual emission budget. 4% goes to a cost containment reserve. Then about 30% goes to prevent carbon leakage, so free allocation. And the rest, so it's going to vary from a year to another, but the rest is split into 4, and we put it up for sale during 4 auction events. I don't want to go in much detail about free allocation, but I wanted to speak a little bit about the trade-off that Dallas mentioned earlier, where we're facing a challenge in Quebec. And if we were to not decrease our free allocation volumes, we would have a lot of problem creating revenues from auctioning the allowances. So we are in the midst of creating new allocation rules for 2024 period to 2030. It's under development and close negotiation with the industry and other relevant stakeholders, but I wanted to speak a little bit about something that we've observed in Quebec, and if we were to keep the same levels of free allocation, because let's say we have a new emitter coming in, or the GDP continues to grow, it would represent a problem in terms of a shortage for auctions, and lower our ambition in terms of supporting other sectors to reduce their own emission. So to speak a bit of the auctions and how we get the proceeds, we have a minimum price that increase every year. So the floor price increased by 5% plus inflation. And just to give you an idea, in 2021, the price for an allowances in Canadian dollars is 17.36 and 17.71 in US dollars. And for each joint auction, we take the highest of the 2 jurisdictions minimum price with the exchange rate. So the last year has shown us that our program is very resilient to supply and demand fluctuation because of the pandemic. We've seen 2 auctions, the one in May and November that were undersubscribed, but the last one in February was fully subscribed. So we see how resilient the auction process and our supply and demand mechanisms work well here. We've held 26 joint auction with California since 2014. Yeah. So each jurisdiction receive a percentage of the revenues corresponding to its share of emission that it put up for sale. So it's about 85% for California and 15% for Quebec, ballpark. All proceeds in Quebec goes to the Electrification and Climate Change Fund, are 100% earmarked to support climate actions. We're gonna get more into that in the next slides. Just so you know, we're in the middle of a transformation. We used to have the Plan Against Climate Change that received this support from the Green Fund. So it's a little bit of a rebranding because the new government in place really want to focus on electrification, but it's also a deeper reform, I would say, because but Quebec suffered a lot of critiques in the first phase of its program, critiques about the fact that it lacked accountability, transparency, and it means that there was a need to change the way the governance of the program and make it more transparent and more easy to read, and that would help also feeling the price signal more and mobilize also the population. So we're in 2020, last November actually, the new plan for green economy was finally unveiled after years of consultation. And for the first phase, so it's going to be implementation plan for 5 years. So for the first 5 years, we have a 6.5 billion budget. So it's all Canadian dollars here. Oh, sorry. So the plan for green economy, as I was saying, went into a bit of a transformation. Ministry of Environment got the full responsibility and with support from other organizations and ministry, of course, but it's going to be ultimately responsible for the conduction of the plan. The plan will be executed through 5 years implementation plan, I was saying, and is articulated around 4 main action: to electrify transportation industry and building, to innovate, to improve performance and supplement the hydroelectricity, to supplement the hydroelectric network with other sources of clean energy, and to adapt. So adapt to prevent from flooding, coastal erosion. With the freezing and non-freezing in Quebec, we have a lot of those problems. And to work in unison, it's to lead per example. So government, businesses, municipalities, and citizens must all work together. So you'll see a little bit more detail what it means in real life. So another great pie chart here. As you can see, most of our spending, so these are unconfirmed numbers because it has just been unveiled, and some of the funds are still waiting to be confirmed, but it provides a fairly good assessment of where the funds are going. 55% is going to go in the transport sector to electrify and lower our emission. As you can, if you remember, transport section is responsible for 43% of our GHG emission overall. Other really important is going to be to actions to support industry in their transition towards cleaner energy and more sober in carbon. The rest is going to go in buildings. If you're wondering what is other, it's governance, international mobilization, adaptation measures as well. So it's a bit of a melting pot there. This one is in French. If you remember, we do speak French here. So it's the distribution of the spendings. I don't want to get too much into this, but just to show you that the blue part here is the mitigation actions, and the rest is so the orange is to develop new energy sectors like green hydrogen and etc. Here in gray is to adaptation measures. Here is to mobilize the population and lead by example for the government. And the last one is to accelerate the development of knowledge. So the main objective is to leverage our hydroelectricity to become the battery of Northeastern America. So this is not my pitch for branding, but it's actually what has been said about the plan in public. So we have a lot of hydroelectricity power, and we want to make sure that we can replace imported fuels with green energy produced here in Quebec. And it's for Quebec, but also for all the region going to the Northeast America as well. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but 99.8% of our electricity is already produced through green, clean and renewable sources. But we still import a lot of fuel. So, and 57% of our trade deficit is from our imported GHG emissions. So, just so you know that it's obviously the target is obviously to reduce GHG emission and fight climate change, but there's also a very great commercial incentive there in choosing the hydroelectricity as and the electrification of transport and all the businesses as a main focus for this plan. So these are three areas I'm going to focus about for this presentation, but I can also provide more information if you're interested in other sectors. So the key measure in transport is the electric vehicles rebate. So it's not new. This is just a continuation of the older plans. We give $8,000 rebate per vehicle for individual vehicle. But there are also rebate given for charging station at home and at work. So this has been working very well. We also adopted in 2018 a ZEV standard in Quebec. We were the first province to do so. And we have the highest amount of electric vehicles in our vehicle park in Quebec from the rest of Canada. We have different targets here, and we announced a ban on gasoline-powered vehicles as of 2035, similar to California.
And it's just a quick reminder that you want to wrap up sometime in the next minute so we can still squeeze some questions in. Thanks.
Perfect. So maybe I'm just going to focus on key measure for industry and go straight to the end of the presentation, which is really new with the measure for industry is a new consignment mechanism. There is one in California and there has been one since the beginning of their program, but we haven't had that yet. And what we were going to ask is to for the covered emitter in the system to give additional efforts, about 3% more than they were used to. And what we're going to do is that we're going to put auction up for sale at put units up for sale at auction, and we're going to reserve the funds that are collected through the sale of those units to the name of the covered entity itself. And those are going to finance some GHG reduction project or R&D for this specific entity, so for the specific emitters. They're going to have to acquire the fund, they're going to have to prove with a study that they can lower their emission. And the funds are going to expire after 5 years, so it's going to be important that they do provide information to acquire the fund and use it optimally. So there's going to be a lot of things on for that, and it's really interesting. It's still under consultation, but we're at the end of the process, so I'm confident enough to show you today. And so we have measures for building as well, and for other measures, flood risk prevention, afforestation. But what I wanted to focus on was governance measures, just so you understand that it can also prove helpful to have revenues from ETS to support the wages, so the salaries of the program staff, so the ETS program staff and the plan for green economy program staff are all, their salaries are all supported by the ETS revenues itself, and it represents about 130 people in Quebec. And that's super helpful. And maybe just to show you that from 1990 to 2017, we've observed some reduction in the industry sector, as well as the residential commercial institution and the waste sector. But we've seen some increase in the transport section, and it's why we're focusing that much on electrification of transport. We have the power to do so, and we're expecting that the measures in the new program should help reduce that amount and help us get to our final target, which is to lower by 29 million tons our reduction, our emissions by 2030. And as you can see, we also have a carbon neutrality target for 2050. But the plan itself should account for about 12 million tons of for the first 5 years. So we're going to be expecting to do even more for the next phase of that plan. So that's about it. I'm sorry if I
No. That's absolutely, that's brilliant, and thanks a lot for a very impressive, comprehensive overview, and also a quite ambitious program. I should think, like in terms of being 100% invested into green, but also using the money to really get some transformative change happening, which is, I guess, sort of an element that you also find in Europe, but perhaps not as coherent necessarily as we've seen it in the Quebec example. So. We have a little more time for questions. And first of all, just a reminder, or very first of all, thanks for all the speakers for great presentations. But second of all, then a reminder to all you listening in that now would be a great time to shoot your questions through the chat, through the question and answer function. A few have been raised already in the question and answer, and to some extent also already addressed there. While I'm inviting everybody to type in their questions, I'm just going to shoot ahead with one quick question. And that goes to well, whoever feels most qualified to comment first. We had in the poll in the beginning also the notion that received quite some support that revenues could be used to assist vulnerable groups, right? To sort of assist those groups that find it hardest to deal with increasing carbon prices. And to Dallas, to Katja, to Anne, to Anais, from your experience, if there's one favorite example that you want to share how that can work in practice, I'd be interested if you have sort of something you would want to highlight from your own countries or from other countries where you think that can really work well. Dallas has opened his mic, so I'm assuming you want to shoot ahead.
Yeah, you asked for a favorite example. I don't know if it's the example that's the most cost effective or reaches the most people, but my favorite example is the use of auction revenue in California to make electric vehicles available to low income and especially farm worker communities on a shared basis and charging availability. So there's a lot of carpooling. Farm workers pile into a car, drive for an hour to a given field or whatever. And there's been an attempt to bring used electric vehicles to make them available and at an affordable cost. And although it's not so widespread, it's very popular among those communities that otherwise tend to feel left out from many of the kinds of programs that we see, upper middle income households able to take advantage of.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's an excellent example. I hadn't come across. Katja, do we want to provide one case?
Well, but we are always pointing out that really the programs that are being funded in Germany through the Energy and Climate Fund, of course, they're open to everybody, so they don't exclude low-income households, but there's nothing in there really explicitly targeting low-income households. Like, how are they going to be doing a full-scale renovation in their home if money is low? And so there's, I guess, two programs which I really like. One is from France, but I'm not sure whether it's being funded by the auctioning revenues, but this is particularly tackling renovation and refurbishment of houses, of buildings for low-income households. So it's giving a very good grant. And the interesting part about it is that we realized that low-income households, they usually have a lot of issues on their plate, and they might not really come across any climate or energy efficiency program. So in the case of France, actually, they get approached by even the postman by putting in a flyer and getting into a conversation about energy efficiency, or by social workers. So the burden of providing information is put onto some other people, not the household itself. And I guess the other program, which I kind of like, is the German one, the electricity savings check, which I briefly mentioned, where long-term unemployed people get educated or trained as energy efficiency consultants, and they go peer-to-peer to low-income households and talk about energy efficiency and what they can improve in their houses. Of course, that doesn't usually touch buildings renovations because we have a rental market in Germany, and so then those households can't really do much about the building itself, but they can, of course, do things about how they use energy in their apartments, electricity and heat.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks a lot for these. Anais, do you have favorite case? When should that add us, please?
I think it's quite similar to what Katja is mentioning. In the first phase of the program, we didn't have any specific targeted measures for low-income families or households, but we already have the lowest energy invoice, so the lowest energy cost for household because of our hydroelectricity. So the cost of carbon that would be signaled through our ETS is not really felt by the households, but are felt through their transportation from the fuel they consume at the pump. So I would say that as Dallas, there are probably our rebate on electric vehicles is the most helpful for that. But in the newest version of the plan, we now have some specific and targeted measures like chauffer vert, which is heating green. It helps construction for households that are going to be more energy efficient, and to also do a fuel switch from heating oil to electricity.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, I'm mindful of the time. I'm also mindful that we didn't manage to squeeze in a lot of questions. I'm also mindful because I actually lost connection momentarily in between. I don't have access to the backup of the questions that were posed, but to my idea, most of these have been answered in the chat already. So I hope that is all good. Indeed, we do have to come to a close in a moment, but not without first of all, again, thanking our panelists for doing an excellent job today to walk us through not only kind of the theory and the underlying notions of how auctioning revenue should be spent, but also filling that with lots of not only lots of pie charts, but also lots of great examples for you know, how the buck can have a bang in different parts of the world, and how you can get some extra momentum with the auctioning revenue. So thanks a lot to all four of you for taking time and for walking us through, sharing us with your insights from your respective countries and jurisdictions. Thanks again to the European Commission for making this all possible. As we are drawing to a close, there's two quick announcements I would like to make. First, Dallas mentioned that already. One of the figures he showed was from the forthcoming ICAP status report, which is about to be launched in 2 weeks from now, on the 23rd of March, if I'm not mistaken. And there is a link in the chat where you can register for the webinar that's coming up in 2 weeks, where the status report will be launched. And you're, of course, all invited to come and join there, or to have a look in the status report and find there much more information on auctioning revenues and how it's being spent, among tons of other important and interesting information. And the other element I just want to flag is the next webinar that's coming up in this series. On the 7th of April, again, Wednesday, we'll take a look at communicating carbon pricing. So just to pick up the point that very often carbon pricing is not adequately communicated, is very often misunderstood or misrepresented, and we want to dive a bit deeper into how can carbon pricing be communicated effectively and avoiding some of the pitfalls, such as, for instance, as I've learned, not to let economists talk for too long. That's usually not a good idea if you want to get the point across. In that spirit, we'll see who we can get together. Not too many economists then, I hope. So that is coming up on Wednesday, the 7th of April, and we'll be send invitations, reminders out to everybody who registered for this event, as well as through the usual channels. And then just because the question also came up about recording, we have been recording this session and we will make it available, I think, on the website where we also shared the slides, but we'll definitely let you know by following up where you can find the recording for this session. Great, so that wraps it up. Then thanks to all of you for sharing with us your insights, for joining us today, and have a great, wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whatever you have where you are. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Merci beaucoup.